41,000 feet over Canada. A brand new jetliner, one of the most advanced in the world. And then, silence. Both engines have stopped, not failed, not broken. The aircraft has simply run out of fuel in midair at cruising altitude with 69 people on board. Ahead of them, no airport in range. Below them, a former airbase turned racetrack, crowded with people. What happened next became one of the most extraordinary feats of flying ever recorded. July 23, 1983. Air Canada Flight 143 is set to fly from Montreal to Edmonton with a stop in Ottawa. The aircraft is a Boeing 767, at the time, cutting edge. One of the first airliners with a glass cockpit, computerized screens instead of dials. And it carried one more distinction that would matter enormously that day. Canada was in the middle of switching to the metric system. This 767 was one of Air Canada's first aircraft to measure its fuel in kilograms and liters, instead of the pounds and gallons every previous airliner had used. But there was a problem. The aircraft's automatic fuel gauges weren't working. A fault in the fuel quantity system had left the cockpit fuel readout blank. In command, Captain Bob Pearson, a highly experienced pilot, and, crucially, a skilled glider pilot in his spare time. Beside him, First Officer Maurice Quintal, a former Air Force pilot who knew this part of the country well. With no working fuel gauges, the crew would have to do something pilots almost never do: calculate their fuel by hand. To find out how much fuel was already in the tanks, the ground crew used a manual measuring stick, a drip stick. It told them the volume of fuel in the tanks, measured in liters. Now came the critical step. They needed to convert that volume of fuel in liters into a weight, and the aircraft needed its fuel weight in kilograms. To convert liters to kilograms, you multiply by about 0.8, but the number the crew used was 1.77, the figure for converting liters to pounds, left over from the old imperial system. It was an honest, easy mistake during a confusing transition between two systems of measurement. But the consequence was enormous. The calculation told them they had plenty of fuel for the journey. In reality, they had loaded barely half the fuel required to reach Edmonton. The aircraft took off, climbed to altitude, and headed west, burning through a tank that was emptying far faster than anyone on board realized. Cruising at 41,000 feet, a warning tone suddenly sounded in the cockpit. A fuel pressure problem on the left side. The crew began diverting toward Winnipeg, the nearest major airport. Then the left engine flamed out. Starved of fuel, it simply stopped. Minutes later, a long, low warning tone the crew had never heard in training filled the cockpit, the sound of total power loss. The second engine quit, and with both engines dead, most of the 767's electronic instruments went dark. The aircraft automatically deployed a small emergency turbine into the airflow, a ram air turbine, giving the pilots just enough hydraulic power to move the controls. They had a few basic backup instruments, and not much else. Captain Pearson now had something no airline pilot ever expects: a fully loaded jetliner with no engines, gliding silently toward the ground. But unlike almost any other airline captain in the world, he had spent years flying gliders. He knew exactly how to fly an aircraft with no power. The crew quickly did the grim math. Winnipeg was too far. At their rate of descent, they would fall short of the runway by miles. Then First Officer Quintal remembered something. He had once been stationed at a military base not far away, at a place called Gimli. Gimli had a long runway, and it was within gliding range. It was their only chance. Pearson turned the powerless jet toward it. But there was something the crew didn't know. The old air base had been partly decommissioned. One of its runways was now a racetrack. And that very day, it was packed with cars, racers, and families enjoying a sports event. They were about to glide a silent airliner directly toward a crowd. As Gimli came into view, Pearson realized he was too high and too fast. With no engines, he couldn't simply add power to adjust. If he overshot, there was no second attempt. So he reached for a technique from the world of gliders, a maneuver almost never used in a large airliner. He cross-controlled the aircraft into a side slip, skidding it sideways through the air to bleed off altitude and speed without picking up too much pace. It was a glider pilot's instinct, flown in a 100-ton jet. There was one more problem. With no normal hydraulic power, the crew had dropped the landing gear by gravity. The main wheels locked down, but the nose wheel did not. Below, people on the runway suddenly saw a giant airliner descending silently toward them, including two boys on bicycles directly in its path. The aircraft touched down hard. The unlocked nose gear collapsed, the nose scraping along the pavement in a shower of sparks, which, by chance, helped slow the jet down. Pearson stood on the brakes. The boys pedaled clear. The airliner ground to a halt on the runway, well short of the crowd. A small fire broke out in the nose and was quickly put out by the racetrack's own safety crews. Everyone on board got out. There were only minor injuries during the evacuation. Not a single person died. The investigation that followed traced the accident back through a chain of small failures. The broken fuel gauges, the pressure of a metric transition, and the single wrong conversion number that left the jet half empty. The lessons reshaped how airlines work. It drove stricter procedures for loading and cross-checking fuel, especially during the shift to metric units. It tightened the rules on flying with inoperative equipment, and it became a permanent case study in how a series of tiny, reasonable-seeming errors can stack into a catastrophe. The aircraft itself was repaired and flew for Air Canada for another 25 years, carrying a nickname it would never lose, the Gimli glider. But the deeper reason this story endures is the human one. A captain who happened to fly gliders, a first officer who happened to know a forgotten airfield, two pilots who, handed an almost impossible situation, flew a powerless jet to the ground and saved every soul on board. It wasn't luck. It was skill, meeting preparation, in the few minutes that mattered most. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more stories from the edge of aviation and the sea, the moments that tested people to the limit, and what we learned from them. We'll see you in the next one.